Thank you very much. Now it is up to me to discuss these two papers. I think they are very stimulating papers, and they are two papers from two perspectives on party system change. The one by Lisbeth and Gary is from what they call neo-cleavage theory, and it is very close to Lipset-Rocken. It is very close to what we do. It's an approach which I would call structuralist approach, or maybe the political sociology approach. Your paper is, for lack of a better term, I would call it the functionalist perspective. It's in the tradition of Peter Mayer. It's in the tradition of party system specialists. And it is very interesting to see that the two perspectives, this morning you said, we look at the same thing through different lenses, and that's exactly what you do. Mm-hmm. But I would say in a critical way, each paper itself is divided in two papers, and each paper in turn looks at the same thing in two ways. Mm-hmm. Now, I distinguish the two ways of Jorge Marx first. When I got the paper, and then I got the slides, and I didn't realize that the slides were something very different than the paper. So I saw it now. But I start with what you did in the paper, which is now the second part of the presentation. And there you say, and I thought this was very interesting, what would we expect if there were indeed such a transnational cleavage? We would expect growth of polar parties on immigration and EU integration. Immigration becomes multiculturalism in the slides you present, but we would expect growth of extremes. We would expect polarization on this divide on the one hand, and greater internal division, and third, of middle-of-the-road parties, and third, we would expect alignment of the two issues in the positioning of parties. So this is exactly what you show in the second part. Now, in the first part, you say it's all about position shift. That is overlapping with the second part, with vote shift, and with new parties. New parties is not part of the second part, but new parties is actually the main story of the first part. So how do the first part and the second part fit together? This is my first question. My second point is, you don't talk except in one of the last figure, or in the last figure you present in the second part, salience is absent. And this morning you said to us, I mean, all is salience driven. And now I say to you, where is salience? And I mean, I tell you where I see salience on your side. I see it in the vote shares. You actually measure weight position by vote shares in order to get to the polarization.
That's funny, when you say salience, I see vote shares.
Exactly. I mean, we have different indicators for the same thing and call it something else. Now imagine us speaking to students or a public audience. We just confuse the people. But that's the state of the art of our discipline. Everybody has his own language, and you manage to have your own language changed in the same presentation, which is quite a feat. I mean, position shift, vote shift, new parties, and then vote moves to the extremes, growth of polar parties, and polarization, which is position times vote share, and then alignment of different kinds of issues, multiculturalism and European integration. So I think your results are absolutely great. But you should, I think, conceptually agree with yourself and show how you relate to conception of other people. I mean, that is, of course, something which I also could say to myself. Now Thomas, you also have two papers in one paper. The first paper is on party system change overall in terms of volatility and fragmentation. This is a Peter Mayer type analysis, which is, I think, is very useful to do, but it lacks something which the analysis of the political sociologists insist very much upon, namely, what are the structural conflicts underlying these kind of changes, and what kind of parties are benefiting or driving these changes? And I mean, it's a relatively limited kind of analysis. And the only thing I have to say about this part of your paper, the presentation, the figures you do show the distributions, the distributions of points, that is, of the parties on the dimensions you are interested in or over time. And I think this is not enough. You should also show the development over time in a sort of regression line, and the bivariate relationship between fragmentation and polarization in a sort of regression line. That would be, I think, very helpful. Now, the second part of the paper moves away from the purely functionalist analysis type Mayer and moves into the direction which is closer to the structuralist approach, because now you look at Euroscepticism. And first you show how Eurosceptic parties develop individually, and then you do something which I think is really very original. You try to say, you come in with this satisfaction with democracy, and you try to say, even if in Northwestern Europe there is no increase in dissatisfaction with democracy, so at first sight everything is okay, even if that is the case, dissatisfaction with democracy is concentrating on a certain type of party, and you are saying it's Eurosceptic parties. So that is your sorting effect. But I must admit, I first didn't understand what you did, because I was set on the wrong foot by the first part of your paper. Because the first part of your paper talks about the system in general. And I thought you were talking about systemic aspects in the second part too. The concentration of dissatisfaction, you say, is going on in the second part. But in order to show this, you could not just look at Eurosceptic parties, because it could be that in earlier times dissatisfaction was also concentrated, let's say, on the radical left, or dissatisfaction was concentrated among abstentionists. So populist authors in the populist literature, they would say, if the dissatisfied are moving from abstention to participation because they now have an offer which was not there before, it is, in fact, a reinforcement of democracy. So in order to show what you want to show, I think you cannot just do OLS with one type of party. You should do a multinomial analysis with party families as dependent variables, and importantly, including also the abstentionist category as one of the aspects of the dependent variable. So that would move you more into the systemic direction and more into the direction of the structuralist approach. Now, for Gary and Lisbeth, I would say the distinction between what you do and what we do is maybe that you, at least in the first part of your presentation, you focus very much on individual parties. And we focus more on systemic characteristics. When we have just polarization, salience overall, and then politicization of an issue. In the end, we also come to individual parties, but your unit of analysis is over a long stretch of your paper is the individual party. And I think to summarize the information, it is better to move to the systemic level first, and then, I mean the other way around, and then come to the individual parties in the end. I was very pleased, I must say, that you picked up our 3 parts of Europe, the Northwest, the South, and the East, because I really think there is a lot of music in this kind of distinction, although I agree with the results you show. Estonia and Hungary is very different. If you then look closely at individual countries, you see that the regional, intra-regional differences are still very, very big. So although this is the case, I still think it makes a lot of sense to distinguish the 3 regions. And I think your results confirm what I'm saying.